Thanks very much for everyone for joining us today. My name's Simon Coughlin. I'm a director here at Babel. We are a London-based tech B2B PR agency. We work with tech clients across multiple sectors, and I'm pleased to see many of those clients with us today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. We will allow time for some questions at the end of the discussion, but do feel free to use the chat functionality on Teams if there's anything you want to raise with any of the panelists during the discussion. First of all, I'd like to welcome our panelists. Firstly, Martin Stade is the data editor at the Financial Times. He leads a group within the FT's visual and data journalism team that focuses on computational and data journalism projects, particularly those that involve automation or applications of artificial intelligence. David Taylor is the Chief Communications and ESG Officer at Paragon, a technology-driven provider of transformational business services. He is passionate about the importance of using data to tell stories and create compelling content. Paragon is a Babel client, and in recent months, we've been working with the team to release 2 data-heavy research reports focusing on customer comms and sustainability. Finally, Lucy Stewart is the head of client services at research consultancy Centerswide. She has extensive experience of working with tech firms to capture thoughts and opinions from a vast number of audience groups. Many thanks to Lucy, David, and Martin for joining us today.
Pleasure.
So, the focus of today's discussion is data. If you work in PR and marketing, and I know most of you do, you will know that data plays an important role in every day of our work. Not only does it help us to provide insights about our target audiences, but data is an integral ingredient of the content that we create. From press releases and white papers to product brochures and website copy, data forms the foundations of the claims that we communicate to our stakeholders. And from a media perspective, data holds massive value in the eyes of journalists. They rely on it to form the basis of evidence-backed articles. However, with journalists receiving data-rich reports and press releases on a daily basis, how do tech brands ensure that they select the right type of data to gain traction with the media and ultimately with their target audiences? So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to our panelists. The first question, I'm going to turn to Martin. Can we just kick off with some intros, please, Martin? Can you outline your role at the FT and why data plays such an important role in your stories?
Okay, I'll start with the second half of that first. Data obviously plays a huge part in the FT's journalism. A lot of what we cover is invisible. It's something you can't photograph. Big abstractions like market movements and economic phenomena. These are things you can measure and display visually, visualizations of that data, but you can't photograph them, for example, right? So, and therefore, it's really important for an organization like ours to have the skills necessary to do that work. And as a consequence of that, the visual and data journalism team is actually the single biggest team within the FT newsroom, and I lead only just a small part of that. But what we do across that team is support the rest of the newsroom with all sorts of things to do with handling, analyzing, and visualizing data. So we help reporters across all subject matters source data. We help them analyze it if they don't have the technical expertise to do this, especially to do that at newsroom speeds, because it's one thing to know how to use Excel, it's another how to use it fast enough for news reporting. And then we'll produce all the charts and maps that you see in the FT and so on. And then on top of that, I have a particular responsibility for anything that involves continuously updating data. So things where we're automating the processes of ingesting that data into our systems. So that is, you'll probably be familiar with what we did around COVID and during the pandemic, that's a continuous tracking of epidemiological data. This next year, I'm going to be worrying a lot about elections, as there's a lot of them coming up around the world. Those are classic cases where it's not good enough to do this stuff reactively. You have to pre-prepare automated systems for doing that work.
Great. And in terms of the type of data which you typically receive into your inbox, Martin, I think when we work with clients, we typically use two different types of data. So that's either the data that we source from inside a business or third-party data. So we work with the likes of SensorsWide, Lucy on the webinar today to source that data. In your eyes, Martin, is one type of data stronger than the other? And what is the ideal type of data that companies can share with journalists like yourself?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, Lucy, but I'm going to say that the thing that I really like to get is internal data from companies, particularly one type of such data when it is data that is useful beyond the thing that it was originally gathered for within the organization, especially things that help us tell a story about the wider world, not just sort of highlight a company's expertise or insights about their industry, but actually use it as almost an alternative economic indicator. There's lots of examples of that that particularly during the pandemic became really notable because even the Bank of England started talking about this as a way of augmenting the official data sources, which tend to be quite slow moving. So we started seeing things like box office data from Box Office Mojo being used as an indicator of the entertainment industry's recovery from the pandemic. Similarly, we saw job recruitment ad and salary data from Indeed become a sort of employment indicator. So these are really good examples. And of course, there's things from the mobile industry. O2 and Google both put out really interesting mobility data that was obviously, all of this was gathered for internal purposes, but has become much more useful as a more general indicator of things happening outside the organizations that originated them. So that is my absolute favorite kind of thing to get. There's other cases where the actual purpose of the data is the thing that it's useful for, and in that case, companies that are able to very responsively help us in our news coverage are particularly valuable. So, for example, the betting market, Betfair, is really good at sharing data about current events as they arise, doing it really quickly in response to journalist requests. Flight Radar 24 is a flight tracking system. Is a really important resource for lots of different types of stories. Everything from flight movements around Ukraine and tracking particular individuals. Like there's all sorts of things that data is really useful, and they've become really good at being responsive to journalist requests for that. There's other companies that have been doing this for a really long time. So I'm thinking, in some of these sort of alternative indicator things, this sounds like a newfangled thing, but actually, Nationwide and Halifax have been using their mortgage data as a housing market indicator for decades. So this is a really well established practice and one that's probably the most valuable thing. I think we're going to be talking about third party and survey data a lot more later on. So I'll hold my fire on that.
Great, thank you, Martin. Turning to Lucy, can you outline your role at SensorsWide, what the company does, the range of services you provide, and how you typically work with clients to source data?
Yes, absolutely. Firstly, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. SensorsWide is a research company. We specialize in both quantitative, which is the online surveys, and qualitative research, so traditional means like focus groups, depth interviews, etc. For the purpose of today's webinar, I'm just going to talk about the online surveys, really, so just the quantitative research. We work with clients primarily on the surveys to deliver a news story at the end of the day. It's really important that clients can use that data to support and back up claims that maybe they've assumed and just want kind of the black and white data to go alongside it to support that. My role as head of client services sees me ensure that the company is staying at the forefront of the research that we deliver. So everything from the research methods that we deliver to clients products themselves that we offer, reporting styles, and obviously customer service. So all of those elements are kind of on my day-to-day radar in terms of making sure, is there something that we're missing? Are clients looking for something else here? I know we're going to go on and talk about AI a little bit later on, but that's the prime example of kind of seeing what's going on in the world right now. How is that impacting research? And how can we be paying attention to that to ensure that our clients at the end of the day are getting the best service and product possible?
Thank you, Lucy. Now, when you first, I just want to ask, when you first start working on a research project, I think when we typically go to you, we're working with a client and we say we want to test a hypothesis, or perhaps we've got some headlines, ideal headlines that we want to come out as a result of the research that we do. How typical is that approach that a client comes to you and says they want to test a hypothesis or they want to end up with these types of headlines? And how do you approach that test?
Sure, it's extremely typical and it's encouraged on our side. So we always say that the best way to start a survey in terms of a survey to support a news agenda ultimately is to start with the headlines. So what do you want the research to show? That might sound a little bit contrived, and bear with me because there's a lot that goes into making sure that it's not contrived. But it's start with the intended outcome. Think about exactly what's that dream headline? What's the intended narrative that you would love to achieve from the research? Think about where you want the coverage to land. So do you want it to kind of get lots of trade coverage? Do you want it to be shared on social? Do you want it to support a white paper? So think about what's kind of the intended outcome and work with your research agency. So a massive part of what we do is we have an internal creative team. They take that initial brief, they look at those headlines and work backwards to make sure that the questions are going to kind of serve those headlines. And when I said a second ago, bear with me, it might sound a bit contrived. There's then a fair few steps that go between that. So we'll start with the questions in terms of making sure that they are working towards that intended headline and outcome. We've then got a compliance team. So the compliance team go through those questions, make sure that they are not leading in any way, that we've got an opt-out where there needs to be an opt-out, and essentially just sort of pull us back a little bit. So where we might have been pushing a little bit to kind of get an intended headline, they will pull us back and make sure that those questions are absolutely compliant by MRS standard and are ultimately not too self-serving. And I think that's really important when it comes to thinking about what the research narrative is at the beginning. It's important that we and our clients keep in mind that this is a piece of news at the end of the day. It mustn't be too self-serving because that will be completely obvious as to the intention of the research. So it was actually really interesting listening to what Martin was saying a second ago about research, successful research being research that looks kind of at the bigger picture, wider world research, which I think is really interesting because that's something that's important for us and our clients to keep in mind. Yes, it's really important to have those intended headlines and for us to deliver questions that work towards them, but it's also thinking about the bigger picture. And that's what's going to help as well when the data comes back, if potentially the outcomes, and I know I'm jumping ahead a bit here, but if the outcomes aren't maybe what was expected, if you've thought about kind of bigger picture outcomes, then that's going to really, really help at the end of the day as well.
And you talked, Lucy, about making sure that data set is compliant. From your perspective, what are the criteria that you use when creating a data set? Are there any minimum requirements that you recommend to clients before they push that data set into the external environment?
Yes, there's a few things to consider. So when we take a brief from a client, the first thing to consider is who's the target audience? So who do we want to be polling for this? Is it CTOs? Is it CIOs? Is it business owners? Is it consumers? We will think about the intended outcomes in terms of the headlines, in terms of where the coverage needs to land and so on. Who is that target audience? It's then thinking about what is considered to be a robust sample size. When I say robust sample size, it's what journalists are going to accept. Yes, that's definitely a big influence on what we would recommend in terms of sample size, but ultimately it's what's statistically robust, statistically representative of a population. So on the general consumer side, we tend to recommend a minimum of 1,000, probably 2,000 is better, and that's because a general consumer has an incidence rate of 100%. If you're polling CTOs, the incidence rate for a CTO within the population is far lower. So you can have a much smaller sample size and it still be considered statistically robust. So that's the kind of the first thing to consider. It's the audience and it's the sample size. It's then thinking about the questions, and it's making sure that they are compliant and they're non-leading, and they're not self-serving, and they're robust by the standards of the MRS code. And it's then thinking about the analysis. So when going through and analysing the data, there's a few pitfalls that I suppose would be easy to fall into. The primary one is not analysing data that has too small of a sample size. Not necessarily overall, because I've already talked about kind of what's considered an overall robust sample size, statistically speaking. But individually, so if you're looking at the demographic splits, for example, company size might be something that you're looking at. If you have fewer than 50 respondents in any of those kind of breakdowns, that wouldn't be deemed statistically robust for analysis. It might be interesting for you to look at internally speaking, absolutely. So it's not useless data by any means. But if you're crafting something for kind of going into the public domain, statistically speaking, you need at least 50 to make those comparisons. And alongside all of that comes quality assurance. So there's a few steps that any good research company should take. We certainly take them. And that is timing respondents to make sure that they are not answering at speed, checking for flatlining. So just where you select the top or bottom answer. We include red herring questions, particularly on the tech side. It's important that these respondents are kind of caught out, as it were, and we make sure that they do know what they're talking about. They've gone through the screening questions, they've gone through the double opt-in, so they should know what they're talking about. But red herring questions allow us to be absolutely sure. And there's a few more steps as well, but that kind of quality assurance process is extremely important as well.
Thank you, Lucy. You talked about robustness in data sets. Martin, from a journalist point of view, what for you represents robust data? Are there minimum criteria that you consider before you will allow data to be used in one of your stories?
Not formally, but I think if we're talking specifically about research data, quantitative survey type data, I would just echo everything that Lucy's just said. On sampling in particular, a couple of things that we look out for is the who actually conducted the research. Is it a reputable research organization or just some fly-by-night organization that's going to put out a not statistically robust survey? We would want full transparency about that, about all of the factors that were just mentioned, the sample sizes, the intended population, the who did it, by what means. We would expect to have access to the cross-tabulation files of the data, so the underlying spreadsheets, not just the headlines that you want to draw out from it. And it's surprising to me how often press releases that are centered around surveys, when you respond to them, people aren't able to give you that. That's really the basics, and we wouldn't touch anything where you can't easily answer those questions. More generally, I would say we're not actually big fans of one-off surveys, right? Regardless of how robust your sampling methodology, there is always sampling error, and so any one survey can be an outlier, and it's much more difficult for a longitudinal time series of identical surveys to be consistently wrong, or if they are, at least you get the direction of travel. And so we much prefer series of research that continue over time, and we're much more likely to take seriously longitudinal studies that are repeated again and again over time at regular intervals.
That makes sense. In terms of when you receive that data, Martin, touch on exclusivity. How important is exclusivity for the FD? Would you prefer if a parent or a company goes directly to you, that you receive that data exclusively? And secondly, in what form do you like to receive the data? Usually, from a PR agency perspective, we put the data into a press release. Do you like to receive data in a press release form, or would you much prefer to receive the raw data?
Raw data every time. Now that may be particular to the FT, where we're accustomed to picking apart data sets and need the raw data to make our own visualizations and so on. Other news organizations may disagree with that. So, but absolutely, if you can't provide a spreadsheet, if you can't provide a machine-readable version of the data, we're just not going to be able to do very much with it. So we'll probably just ignore it. So that's absolutely essential as far as we're concerned, and I'm only speaking for my own news organization here. On exclusivity is always important for journalists, but I think, and with access to data, that's no different. But I would say that in my experience, the basis of exclusivity, the way we achieve it with a lot of data stories, is simply by doing things with data that's theoretically in the public domain, but with which other news organizations simply don't have the skills or technical wherewithal to do or to compete with, certainly at the speed we can. And so that comes back to that data access question again. So being able to access the data is far more important to us than exclusivity necessarily, because often we can create our own exclusivity by what we do with that data. So yeah, it's nice to have a head start on things, but to be honest, that's less important than access to the data. Sorry, did I answer all the questions?
Yes, yes, you did. Very comprehensive. Thank you. David, I know you've been waiting patiently in the background. Can you just kick off by outlining your role at Paragon, and specifically from a data perspective, how do you use it in your PR, marketing, and comms role?
Sure. Thanks a lot for the invite, Simon. And Martin, thanks a lot for blowing apart all my myths, preconceived, ideas of success. Actually, I think you've taught me a few lessons straight away in some of those. So my role is to lead the communications on a one-to-many basis, so through PR and marketing, as well as one-to-one through bids and tenders. As a B2B organization, that's the lifeblood of our growth. But alongside that, I also lead the ESG, the sustainability for the organization, backed by a very talented team, some of whom are here today. The link between those two things is really important to us as a company, to make sure that we have integrity about how we talk about our sustainability credentials. Data is at the core of that. Increasingly, we've moved from an era in which stating your ambitions and your aims in sustainability or in your strategy is no longer acceptable. You have to back that up with facts and data. And over the next few years, we will be building repeatable, measurable data sets to make sure we are being successful in those situations. In terms of what Paragon does, we are a business services company, predominantly based in Europe, but very growth-minded, quite acquisitive. I expect us to be in new geographies fairly soon. Our job is to help our clients, many of whom are in regulated, needing to be very compliant sectors, helping them to connect with their customers, either through communications like a statement or a marketing message, but also with their employees. So through workplace services, on-site creative services, that sort of thing as well. We are surrounded by data in everything that we do. So we take tons and tons of customer data, and we process that on behalf of our clients to give meaning to the communications and to the services that we provide. We're not allowed to use that for our own insights. So it's surrounded by water, but I can't drink any of it. but that sort of knowledge of data and the understanding of the value of that data carries through in how we use that in our communications. And so working with Simon and the team, we've created a series of surveys, combined that then with taking those findings to our clients and going through a series of interviews, for example, with our clients to get their reaction to some of those findings. And Martin, interesting to hear you talk about how internal data can be used to kind of create further meaning. That narrative was really valuable. So using data, not just in a journalistic way or to create press releases, but actually to have narrative to our client stakeholders, take that meaning to them, and move our normal conversation about business in general into what our data is suggesting, and this first party consumer data that we found, taking their reaction. It moves that conversation into a new area, and we found those conversations really insightful. So not really purely based on the purpose of the data, but using it for other means. So yeah, that's been our experience of the data and how that's fitted into my role. So.
Thanks, David. And the title of this webinar was, we were asking whether PR and marketing professionals are suffering from what we call data fatigue. I think I've been working in this industry for many years now, and so have you, David. So it can often feel, I think, sometimes that we've got loads of data at our disposal, but it's really deciding how best to use that from a external point of view. So what's your view on this data fatigue hypothesis? I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's data everywhere now, and I think it's really difficult to select the bit that you want. And I think actually, using examples like the Nationwide's sort of mortgage data as an indicator of the housing market, it's that consistency. It's like that one piece of data has meaning. I'm therefore going to ignore the rest of it. So you don't get fatigue because you're focused on the depth of that data in particular. You're not constantly distracted. So I think you've got to give your teams and give yourself a chance to choose data, analyze that data, get meaning from that data, and then preferably to have that come through as a stream, continuously kind of looking at that and taking that meaning. Because you start dodging around and you're getting all these extra sources in here, you never get to the depth, you never get to the meaning. It is just purely data. And then I think you do get fatigue. That deluge will wear you out. So I think that's certainly a way to get rid of that. I think the other thing is on the client side of things. That was a real surprise for me. Taking some of the insights that we got from the surveys and the research that we carried out, Simon, and speaking to our clients about it and sharing that view. Suddenly, you lift the bonnet and you share. There's a reciprocation there. And you start to share. We didn't go, here's the 5 key findings. We went right into the full set of data and found things that we didn't actually publish in our press releases and our reports, but became little nuggets of information that we shared between us. And that enabled us to bring insights out and share that with my sales teams, with the marketing teams, and a shared secret between clients that moved the conversation on that couldn't have happened without the data. Now that definitely removes that fatigue because you're in deep and you're taking it to stages beyond just the public facing side of it.
Yeah, I certainly resonate with that, David. I think that when we work with data, work with clients around data, it's not just a matter of sourcing that data for PR, media relations. From that perspective, you guys can use it from a multifaceted approach, push it out directly to stakeholders, use it within your sales teams to speak with prospects. So increasingly, we're seeing a greater value in the way that we use data. But also that there's the flip side of the coin, I think, David, and we were speaking before this call about increasingly as PR and market professionals, when we're talking more about data that underpins our messages, increasingly I think we're being challenged on the strength of that data. Do you see that challenge being more regular? And when you're challenged around data points, how do you respond to it?
Yeah, I mean, like I've just said, the deluge of data out there, you can usually find something that contradicts, what your data is saying. You then get into a slightly distracting conversation about the integrity of that data. And Lucy spoke very eloquently about compliance of that data and whether it's statistically important. You just don't want to get into those kind of conversations, really. But it's an everyday occurrence because of the amount of data that's out there. So you have to sometimes take it on the chin. I think when you come up against genuine skepticism, it's usually because somebody has long-held beliefs about something, and they find it deeply uncomfortable that the data is shifting them away from that. Yeah, it's almost pointless to get into that argument. You can't shift a belief with data. You have to work in a different way. Getting somebody that they believe in to evangelize about the data, that has a better way of shifting that set of beliefs. I also think it can be quite cultural. I think if you have an organization and if you're used to using data to drive your business in a certain direction, culturally you're biased towards the truth that comes from data. If you are entrepreneurial, you're a seat of the pants type culture, bringing data into decision making, that isn't really difficult for some people to embrace as well. So you can get those sort of challenges. I think it's far harder to fight against the data that challenges your data, because it can be distracting. So I don't have answers to that, but I've definitely experienced it. But you can't convince people if you don't have the data, but you should always be prepared to see the challenge coming in, even when you do have it.
And Martin, from a journalist perspective, do you find that you have FT readers challenging the data that you include in some of your stories?
Very rarely. It's not a really common occurrence. It's anything that ends up in our pages or on our screens, it has already gone through that vetting process at our end. So there are cases, of course, and the pandemic was quite instructive in this, where data and data collection itself becomes politicized and becomes people are trying to load particular data points with meaning that it may or may not have. This does happen, but it's very, very rare. It's usually only in sort of highly politicized contexts.
Great, that's good to hear. Lucy, you touched on this point earlier on around when you do some research and the resulting data doesn't necessarily fit into the initial hypothesis. When that happens, how do you deal with that situation? What can the client use that data for if it doesn't fit into the intended narrative?
Yep, you're right. It definitely happens. It happens quite regularly. Unfortunately, we can't always guarantee that the way that the data is going to fall out is going to be exactly what people would have expected. I think naturally that'd be incredibly boring if it did happen that way every time, and it wouldn't be particularly realistic. So if in starting with those hypotheses or the headlines, depending on whether you're kind of using it for a marketing or PR function, that's your starting point. That's giving your questions direction, and I think it's really important to start that way. Having said that, it's very important to have an open mind. So when we send our data sets to clients, we will often try and have that conversation and just get a sense of, is that what you expected? How are you feeling about that? And sometimes a conversation will happen where the client simply says, "I can't possibly be right. Can't possibly be right. No, I know this customer, and that can't be right." It's a conversation we have, and that's why it's so important that the research has been conducted in the proper way. So all of the elements that I discussed earlier about timing respondents, double opting in, flatlining, red herring questions, that's why those elements are absolutely vital. And if there is ever room for kind of error at those stages, or at the kind of screening stage where we're actually reaching out to the respondents, then that conversation that we have with clients might have legs, really, and kind of the potential issue that the client has with the data, there might be some room for them being correct. So we have to know that every single time we send a data report, it has been checked beyond belief. Like, we've done so many checks to know that we are 100% confident, and then it's our job to ensure that the client is therefore confident, and has been reassured that all of these steps have been taken. So that's the first element in kind of when the data doesn't come out as clients and expect in terms of what they know about their customer base. The second thing is, that's what makes a fantastic marketer and a fantastic comms professional. It's to look at that data report and it's to go, okay, that's not what we expected, but hey, isn't it still great? And we will work with our clients to make sure that the positive is definitely still seen. I think this plays into what you were talking about earlier, and that's, don't kind of get too don't be too narrow-minded with your data. So make sure that the research that you do has the biggest possible purpose. So yes, it would be fantastic if you can use it for PR purposes, but wouldn't it be also fantastic if your sales team can use it? Wouldn't it also be fantastic if you can use it in marketing materials? So every survey that we design, we think about in that capacity. We think about, let's design a few questions that can be used for this purpose. Let's design a few questions that can be used here. And if you're using a survey to be that kind of multifaceted approach, then you shouldn't be let down on all fronts. Okay, maybe your PR headlines aren't going to come out quite just exactly as you wanted in a dream scenario, but you should still have plenty to use in terms of the sales team, plenty to use in terms of the marketing team. And on the PR side, okay, if your headlines haven't come out as you expected, that's not necessarily the kind of the end of the story. So we would always encourage clients to look through demographic splits, for example. So, okay, the base stat is maybe a lot lower than you'd expected, but what if you looked at company size or sector? Maybe there's a really interesting story about the differences between those, or maybe the story is actually that there isn't a difference. We would have expected there to be a huge difference between the tech sector versus the sales marketing sector. Maybe that's where your story is. So, yeah, it's just trying to be really open-minded about the results, and working with everyone around you, because we appreciate that if you yourself are just kind of stuck there looking at a data report, it can be very, very hard to not be narrow-minded. So have that conversation. I loved what you were saying, David, about speaking to your clients and getting their view. I think that's brilliant, because that's going to open those doors and make sure that you aren't having that kind of narrow-mindedness towards data, and it is then thinking outside the box, which is what an excellent communications professional does. So yeah, that's what I would say to that.
Thank you, Lucy. And David, from a client's perspective, and I know we worked on research projects before where we've started off, we had some ideal headlines in mind, and the data that's come back hasn't necessarily fitted in with what we envisaged. What's your reaction in those situations? How can you use that data? Yeah,
I mean, Lucy said it very eloquently. I think you've got to embrace the disappointment, and actually look at the value that's there. We might not be able to give Martin, the amazing insight that we wanted to and get published in the FT, but at the same time, there's always massive value if it's been done right. There's always massive value in the depth of that, and I think, Simon, we probably had to reverse rationalize a couple of things. We thought we were going to end up with this headline here, and actually, no, nothing has changed. Our insight is that consumers, I think it was the post-COVID customer communications, how has expectations changed through this rapid period of digitization that happened during the lockdown. Well, in reality, consumers were providing a real comfort blanket for organizations to allow them to go through change. I'm quite happy to expect to accept some of the clunkiness that went on, and then the expectation was gradually reset and it was met. So we didn't see these dramatic shifts during that time, but it then allowed us to have that open conversation with the clients, and the value that we got from that conversation then outweighed or balanced perhaps the reduction in the wow that we wanted from that headline. So swings and roundabouts really on that one, Simon.
Thanks, David. We've got about 15 minutes left. If you're listening in and you've got any questions for the panelists, then please do use the chat functionality, and I will review them. I just wanted to save the last section for AI. So we couldn't have a webinar in 2023 without mentioning artificial intelligence. So I wanted to gauge the view of the panelists about their opinion on how AI is and will impact the use of data. Martin, so from a journalist perspective, how is AI impacting your work at the moment? Are you seeing platforms like ChatGPT have a real impact on both the data you're receiving and how you interpret that data?
The short answer is no, not really. I would be a bit horrified if generative AI was affecting the data that we're getting. What I think is changing, and what will change in the medium to long term in terms of the kind of data we're interested in, is that generative AI is almost a misnomer. The reputable news organizations are not going to be using it largely to generate content. We're going to be using it to analyze existing content and to pick apart existing content. And what that means is machine learning generally, and the new generation of large language models in particular, will make it easier to analyze unstructured data. So things that are not in rows and columns of a spreadsheet, but just bodies of text, bodies of images, things that historically have been very difficult to analyze are going to become much easier to analyze. So we're going to be interested in huge corpora of documents rather than just a few spreadsheets. We're going to be interested in satellite imagery. We're already doing a lot of work analyzing satellite imagery in a way that was even a year ago. So, I won't go into details because some of the stuff isn't published yet, but this is a type of data that a year ago we thought of as photography, and now we think of as data, and that's all to do with the capabilities of AI. So I think it will just sort of redefine what we even mean by data, more than affecting the kind of data that we get.
Great. And Lucy, from your perspective, a research agency, is AI currently being used in your analysis or in the way that you source questions?
No, certainly not in analysis, and certainly not in the way that we write questions. The main way that AI is being used, and this is why it's absolutely fantastic for the research world, is in quality checks. So the main area really is open responses. So if you imagine you're running a survey, you've got your open responses. Traditionally, that's been a manual checked process. So we as a team, our kind of production team, would go through those open responses, and anyone that kind of maybe hadn't written something that made much sense or hadn't really answered the question, we'd use that as a kind of way to say, oh, I don't think that respondent has paid attention here. Let's remove them. Let's replace them. So just as we would when we're timing respondents, if respondents have answered too quickly or too slowly, or they flatlined throughout, we say that that's not a quality response. Let's replace and make sure that we do have a quality response. So open response is working exactly the same way, and previously that was a manual task. We've now got this amazing capability of AI software that can do that for us. So yes, it's still manual to some degree because we have to go through and we triple check just to absolutely make sure. But what the AI can do for us is check for patterns that our kind of human eye wouldn't spot. So patterns, any kind of duplications in the open responses. If you imagine you've got 1,000 open responses, it'd be quite easy for human error to take place there and miss any duplications. But having the software in place means that absolutely nothing can be missed. So from that perspective, it's fantastic. On the surface, it could be a bit scary, because for research, our primary focus is making sure that the data is of quality, and a huge part of that is making sure that the respondents are who they say they are. And if you throw AI into the mix there, then on the surface, you've got quite a potentially dangerous recipe. But we don't have to worry about that. I mean, the very first thing that came into effect was bot software. I mean, we're all probably familiar with clicking the traffic lights and recapture or whatever it's called. Our surveys all have that. So kind of that's the very first stage, but that's nothing new. That's been about for a long time. AI is now impacting in several other ways. I've talked about the open responses. There's even more ways that AI is kind of helping the research sector. So for us, it's absolutely fantastic, and it's something to be celebrated. It's not something that we would use in terms of kind of going to ChatGPT to help draft questions. We think the human touch is far more important there, and getting nuances and having the conversations with clients, and we've physically read the brief, so we wouldn't use it for that. It might have a place in opening up kind of the research topic, understanding more about a research topic that some of the researchers maybe aren't familiar with, if it's something that is quite kind of niche or specific. So it might have a purpose there, but that's as far as we would take it at Census-wide. It certainly wouldn't be used to write questions or analyze data or anything like that. We think the human touch is more important for that.
Thank you, Lucy. So just to finish off, we've got a couple of questions from the audience. And we've had this question a few times aimed at Martin, and I guess this is the crux of everything. So from a client perspective, for you, Martin, what kind of data stories are likely to catch your eye? What type of stories are really likely to get into the FT?
That's a very difficult question, because it depends on the subject matter, right? Like, so we support the entire newsroom. So if you ask any reporter on who happens to cover your company, they will answer that question a little bit differently. Things that will catch the eye of the team that I work in centrally is anything where we can get access to the raw data, as I've mentioned, which will enable us to, especially very granular forms of that data, which will allow us to do more interesting types of visualizations of that data. The other thing is just being able to be reactive to things that we originate is something that, in my experience, the PR industry is not very good at. Very few comms people that I talk to have direct access, for example, to the data science or other technical specialist teams within their client businesses. And so they find it very difficult to get us access to the kind of data we need, even if it's, so, we might get a report which has a very interesting chart in it. And if we get in touch and ask for the data underlying that chart, it might take 3 days to happen, and it really shouldn't. And that often just rules out the use of that in a story. So being tied into the data systems of the client businesses, the comms teams being connected directly to the data functions and the businesses is really important. And in my experience, the comms teams that have that sort of access are the most effective at working, certainly with specialists like myself.
Great. And another question. We talked earlier about the value of internal data, but the type of clients that we work with here at Babel, some multinationals, right the way down to some small startups who might not necessarily have access to that huge quantity of data. So for those smaller companies who don't have access to loads of data, Martin, Lucy, David, any tips for how they can use their own data to get some media coverage?
I think it's about getting a hold of something that adds meaning to either what you already know or that you can use as a trigger to create meaning from conversations that you can have internally or with clients. And if there's a gap there, I'll do a sales pitch for you, Lucy. Go and speak to somebody like Lucy, and go and get some of that data, because you need the credibility. You need to show rigor around your kind of theories, your hypotheses, and the best way to do that is to get some good data. If you can't get that through your own systems and the way that your company works, get it from outside. It will then trigger more and more curiosity, more and more insight, layer upon layer, and then suddenly you have something of real value that you can then go out and do some marketing and some PR and talk to your other clients about. So that would be how I would approach it when you're in a slight sort of data desert, perhaps, is create some, because it will generate more.
Great. Okay, that's all the questions we've had. So I'll just wrap it up by thanking all of our panelists today. Lucy, Martin, David, thanks so much for joining us. For everyone who's registered, we're going to be sending a recording of this webinar to everyone, and there'll also be a written report on our website in the coming days. Thanks so much again for your time today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Simon.
Bye.
Bye.